You know what finally convinced me to stop using modern caulk on log structures? It wasn't a book. It wasn't a YouTube video. It was standing inside an 1850s pioneer cabin in the Missouri Ozarks and running my hand along the original chinking between the logs. 160 years old, and it was still solid, still sealed, still doing its job. Then I walked around to the back wall where somebody in the 1980s had scraped out the old chinking and replaced it with silicone caulk. The caulk looked fine on the surface, but when I pressed on the log just above it, my thumb sank in like I was pushing into a wet sponge. The wood behind that silicone had been rotting for decades, and nobody knew it until the damage was catastrophic. That moment changed everything for me. Today I'm going to walk you through exactly how pioneers waterproofed their cabins without a single modern sealant, what they mixed, how they applied it, and why their methods actually outperform most of what we use today. Plus, stick around to the end because I'll share a finishing trick they used that hardens the chinking and keeps insects out, and almost nobody talks about it anymore. Let's get into it. The techniques we're going to cover today come from the frontier settlers who built America's first permanent structures in the wilderness. These weren't decorative projects. These were life and death shelters, and the methods they developed are some of the most practical building knowledge ever passed down. Once you understand the thinking behind them, you'll never look at a tube of caulk the same way again. So let me start with where these methods come from and why they deserve our attention. When we talk about pioneer cabin building, we're really talking about a blend of traditions that came together on the American frontier. Scots-Irish settlers arriving in Appalachia brought knowledge of stone and mud construction. German immigrants in Pennsylvania and the Upper Midwest brought sophisticated log joinery traditions from the Black Forest region. Scandinavian settlers in Minnesota and Wisconsin brought centuries of experience building with timber in cold, wet climates. What all these groups had in common was the same basic problem. When you stack logs to make a wall, you get gaps. Logs aren't perfectly straight. They taper. They have knots and curves, and as they season and dry in the wall, those gaps get wider. If you don't seal those gaps effectively, wind drives through, rain works its way in, and in winter you might as well be sleeping outside. So these settlers developed chinking and daubing systems using whatever materials the land provided. Clay from creek banks, straw or dried grass from meadows, animal hair saved from butchering, wood ash from the fireplace, lime from burning limestone if they could find it. None of these materials cost a penny. All of them were renewable. And here's the part that took me years to fully appreciate. The reason their methods worked so well wasn't just because the materials were good. It was because the entire system was designed to work with wood, not against it. Logs move. They shrink, they swell, they twist, and check as they age. The pioneers knew this because they watched it happen every single season. So they built a sealing system that could move with the wood, breathe with the wood, and be renewed as needed without ever trapping moisture where it would cause damage. That's the core philosophy, and every method I'm about to show you flows directly from it. The first thing I learned from studying original pioneer chinking is that they didn't just start slapping mud into every crack they saw. They read the gaps first, and this is something most people skip entirely when they try to restore or build a log structure today. Not every gap between logs is the same. Some are narrow, maybe a quarter inch where two logs meet closely. Some are wide, 2 inches or more where a log curves, away from its neighbor. Some gaps are shallow, and some are deep enough that you could fit your fist into the space between the logs. The pioneers assessed every single gap individually and made decisions about what kind of filling strategy it needed before they mixed a single batch of chinking. For narrow gaps under about 3/4 of an inch, they often just packed in moss or oakum, a fiber made from old rope, and called it done. For medium gaps between 3/4 of an inch and about an inch and a half, they'd apply their chinking mix directly. But for wide gaps, anything over an inch and a half or so, they would first install a physical backer before any chinking went in. I'll get into the backer materials in a later method, but the key point here is that they understood something fundamental. A thick mass of clay mortar packed into a deep gap will crack as it dries and eventually fall out. But a thin, consistent layer of mortar over a solid backer will flex and hold for generations. When I restored my first log wall, I made the mistake of treating every gap the same way. I mixed up one big batch and started packing it in everywhere. Within 6 months, the wide spots had cracked and half the chinking had fallen to the ground. Once I started reading the gaps the way the old-timers did, the results were completely different. Now let me walk you through the actual chinking recipe, because this is where it gets really interesting. The classic Pioneer chinking mix has 3 main ingredients: clay, animal hair, and wood ash, and each one serves a specific purpose. The clay is your binder. It's what holds everything together and creates the seal. The best clay for chinking is what's called a fat clay, meaning it has a high plasticity and few sand particles. Pioneers typically dug it from creek banks or from deposits a few feet below the topsoil. If you grabbed a handful and rolled it between your palms and it held together in a smooth rope without cracking, that was good clay. If it crumbled or felt gritty, it had too much sand and wouldn't bind properly. The animal hair is your reinforcement. It works exactly like rebar works in concrete. It holds the clay together and prevents cracking as the mix dries and shrinks. Pioneers used whatever they had. Horsehair was considered the best because it's long and strong. Cattle hair worked well, too. Hog hair was shorter, but still useful. Some settlers used goat hair or even dog hair. The hair was typically washed, dried, and then cut into lengths of about 2 to 3 inches before being mixed in. The wood ash is the ingredient that surprised me the most. Ash serves 2 purposes. First, it's mildly light, meaning it discourages insects and resists mold growth. Second, it acts as atite agent that helps the clay cure harder and more durably. Hardwood ash from oak, hickory, or maple was preferred over softwood ash because it has a higher mineral content. The basic ratio that I've found works best, and this is consistent with what I've read in multiple frontier accounts, is roughly 4 parts clay to 1 part wood ash to a generous double handful of animal hair per bucket of mix. You hydrate the clay first, letting it soak in water for at least 24 hours until it's the consistency of thick yogurt. Then you work in the ash and mix it thoroughly. Then you add the hair and fold it in by hand, making sure the fibers are distributed throughout the mix and not clumped in one spot. The final consistency should be like a stiff peanut butter. It should hold its shape when you press it into a gap, but not be so wet that it slumps or sags. By the way, if you are enjoying learning about these old-world methods, I put together something I think you will really appreciate. It is called The Old Ways, and it is a collection of 100 forgotten woodworking secrets from traditional craftsmen around the world. Techniques like the ones we are covering today, and a whole lot more. You can grab your copy by scanning the QR code on screen, or just use the first link in the description. All right, let us keep going. Now here's a distinction that most people miss entirely. Chinking and daubing are not the same thing. Chinking is the bulk fill, the structural material that fills the gap between the logs. Daubing is the finishing coat that goes over the chinking to create a smooth, weather-resistant surface. The pioneers treated these as two separate steps, and for good reason. The chinking mix I just described is designed for bulk and flexibility, but it's porous and rough on the surface. Left exposed, rain would erode it over a few seasons. So once the chinking had dried for several days, sometimes up to a week depending on the weather, they'd come back with a daubing mix. The daubing was typically a finer version of the same clay, screened to remove any pebbles or debris, mixed with a higher proportion of ash and sometimes a small amount of rendered animal, fat or linseed oil. The fat or oil made the surface slightly water repellent without sealing it completely. They'd apply it in a thin layer, maybe 1/8 of an inch to 1/4 inch thick, pressing it firmly over the chinking with their hands, or a flat wooden tool, similar to a modern pointing trowel. The surface was then smoothed and left to cure. What you end up with is a two-layer system, a thick, flexible, reinforced core that fills the gap, and a thin, harder, more weather-resistant shell that protects it from direct exposure. This is exactly the same principle behind modern two-coat plaster systems, and the pioneers figured it out with creek clay and fireplace ash. This brings me to the most important thing I learned from studying these old methods, and it's the reason that silicone caulk is so destructive on log structures. Pioneer chinking breathes. It is vapor permeable, meaning moisture can pass through it slowly in both directions. When the logs swell in wet weather, moisture migrates outward through the wood and passes through the chinking to the outside air. When things dry out, the process reverses slightly. The system stays in equilibrium. Silicone caulk, on the other hand, is a vapor barrier. It seals completely. And that sounds like it should be a good thing, but on a log wall, it's a death sentence. Here's what happens. Moisture that's naturally present in the logs, or that enters through end grain or checks on the exterior, migrates toward the interior as it always has. But when it hits the silicone seal, it can't escape. It pools behind the caulk, right at the junction between the logs. That trapped moisture creates the perfect environment for fungal rot. And because the caulk looks perfectly fine from the outside, the damage is invisible until the logs are structurally compromised. I've seen this on at least a dozen old cabins that well-meaning owners tried to improve with modern sealants. Every single one had significant rot behind the caulk. The pioneer chinking on the same structures, where it hadn't been removed, was protecting sound, solid wood. The clay flexes, too. As logs shrink in dry winter air, the chinking compresses slightly. As they swell in summer humidity, the chinking expands with them. Silicone has some flexibility, but it bonds rigidly to the log surface. So when the wood moves beyond the caulk's stretch capacity, it either peels away, leaving an open gap, or it tears and lets water behind it. The old chinking mix doesn't bond aggressively. It sits in the gap like a compression gasket, held in place by friction and by the physical shape of the gap, rather than by adhesive strength. That's a fundamentally different engineering approach, and it's superior for this application. For gaps wider than about 1.5 inches, the pioneers didn't rely on chinking alone. They installed a physical backer first. The most common backer material was thin wood strips, often rived from straight-grained white oak, or cedar, cut to roughly 1/2 inch thick and wedged tightly into the gap between the logs. Some settlers split these strips with a froe and mallet right at the building site. Others used flat stones in areas where suitable rock was plentiful. In the upper Midwest and Pacific Northwest, dried moss was packed into deep gaps as a backer, especially sphagnum moss, which has natural antimicrobial properties. The backer serves two critical functions. First, it fills the bulk of the void, so your chinking layer stays thin, typically no more than 3/4 of an inch to 1 inch deep. Thin chinking dries evenly and doesn't develop the deep shrinkage cracks that plague thick applications. Second, the backer provides a mechanical key for the chinking to grip. When you press wet clay mortar against a rough wood strip or a wad of dried moss, it locks in and creates a bond that holds even when the gap shifts seasonally. Let me share some patterns I've noticed over the years, things I used to do myself that pioneer builders handled completely differently. The first pattern is reaching for the caulk gun by default. Most of us grew up thinking that sealing something means making it airtight and watertight. But on a log structure, airtight and watertight are two different goals. You want to stop air infiltration, but you need to allow vapor transmission. Pioneer chinking does both. Modern caulk only does one, and it causes the other to become a serious problem. The second pattern is using a single material for every gap size. I did this for years because it's faster. But the pioneers understood that a 1/4 inch gap and a 3-inch gap are completely different engineering challenges. Treating them the same guarantees failure in the wide spots. The third pattern is assuming old methods are primitive. This is the one that kept me from learning these techniques sooner. I figured if modern chemists had developed advanced sealants, those must be better than mud and horse hair. But when I actually compared the long-term performance, the pioneer methods won decisively on log structures. Modern sealants excel on dimensional lumber and sheet goods. On round or hewn logs that move significantly, the old ways are still the best ways. The fourth pattern is neglecting maintenance. Pioneer families checked their chinking every spring and patched any spots that had cracked or loosened over the winter. It took maybe an afternoon. Modern homeowners expect to caulk once and forget it, which is exactly why hidden rot goes undetected for decades. The good news is, once you see these patterns for what they are, you can start shifting your approach one project at a time. Now for that bonus tip I promised at the beginning. This is something I found referenced in 3 separate frontier accounts from the 1830s and 1840s, and I've tested it myself with excellent results. After the daubing coat had fully cured, which usually took about 2 weeks, in warm weather, many pioneer families would brush on a thin wash made from slaked lime. You make this by taking quicklime, which they produced by burning limestone in a simple kiln, and carefully adding it to water until you get a thin, milky liquid about the consistency of heavy cream. This lime wash was brushed over the daubing with a coarse, bristle brush. As it dries, it carbonates, meaning it reabsorbs carbon dioxide from the air and essentially turns back into a thin layer of limestone on the surface. This does 3 things. It hardens the surface of the daubing significantly, making it much more resistant to rain erosion. It creates an alkaline environment that repels insects, particularly mud dauber wasps and carpenter ants that would otherwise burrow into the clay. And it gives the chinking that clean white appearance you see in photographs of well-maintained frontier cabins. I started applying lime wash over my chinking repairs about 4 years ago, and the difference in durability is remarkable. Spots that used to need annual patching are now going 3 or 4 seasons without any attention. Before you head out, I want to make sure you know about my book, The Old Ways. It goes way deeper than any single video can, with 100 forgotten woodworking techniques from traditional craftsmen, 75 detailed photos, and 122 pages of real hands-on knowledge. If you want to bring these old-world methods into your own shop, this is the guide to do it. Just scan the QR code on screen or click the link in the description to get your copy. Thanks for spending time with me today, and if you have not already, hit that subscribe button so you do not miss the next one. I'll see you in the next video. Take care.